Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Richard Crespin, CEO of the international consulting firm CollaborateUp and a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, about the future of USAID and America's use of smart power around the world. And then we break down President Trump's push to end the Russia-Ukraine war, the upheaval in Washington stemming from Elon Musk and the DOGE, and whether the Israel-Hamas ceasefire survives through the weekend. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I am joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. A really good show, jam-packed with news, including a deep dive coming up on the future of USAID, U.S. smart power foreign aid, the impact of Elon Musk's DOGE on all of those things. But before we get to that, as always, first things first, Guy, what's on your radar this week?
Thanks, Ben. Great to be here with you for another week. Off the top, I'm tracking the swirl of developments around President Trump's suddenly energized push to end the Ukraine war, but you've been leading our coverage on that in Threat Status, and I think you're going to brief us on it in a minute here. So I'm separately tracking the ongoing saga over the war-ravaged Gaza Strip, whether or not the Israel-Hamas ceasefire and hostage exchange deal is going to hold much longer. And more pointedly, right now, the fact that Mr. Trump is showing no sign of backing down from his controversial plan to push some 2 million Palestinians out of Gaza and redevelop the war-torn enclave into a Riviera of the Middle East. The president has said Gaza residents would be expected to vacate to nearby Arab countries, raising questions about whether they would be ejected forcibly. He also hasn't ruled out cutting foreign aid to countries such as Egypt and Jordan if they don't take in more Palestinians. It's certainly exciting to see a U.S. president push a radically new concept in the region. But then there's reality. The prospect of resettling huge numbers of Palestinians to Jordan seemed to be a non-starter when Jordan's King Abdullah II was in Washington in recent days and actually met with Mr. Trump at the White House. And then there's also Mr. Trump's threat that, quote, all hell, end quote, will break loose if Hamas does not release the remaining Israeli hostages that the militant group has imprisoned since its October 7, 2023 terrorist attack on Israel. Hamas, backed by Iran, is believed to still be holding 73 hostages. Our team is tracking all of this closely, Ben, amid wariness that Israel is threatening new military operations against Hamas in Gaza if more hostage releases are not imminent.
Fast-moving developments really across the foreign policy spectrum here. And of course, you mentioned, the push to end the Russia-Ukraine war. We knew this was coming. We've been talking about it for months. Trump told us he was going to do it. But it was still kind of shocking this week, I think, to at least some people, when Trump revealed he and Russian President Vladimir Putin had held a long one-on-one conversation about a possible ceasefire deal. You had top defense officials from Britain, Germany, elsewhere blasting the call. They said that the new U.S. administration essentially was already making concessions to Putin before any formal negotiations had even started. It is worth noting Trump also did talk to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and Vice President J.D. Vance is going to meet in person with Zelensky on Friday in Munich on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference there. So I'm not sure it's exactly fair to say that the Trump administration is freezing Ukraine out of these discussions. But it is noteworthy to look at what the opening position is. Guy, I know you'll talk more in a minute about Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and his role here, but he did tell a NATO defense minister summit in Brussels that it's unrealistic for Ukraine to ever get all of its territory back, and also saying to take NATO membership for Ukraine off the table. So that's the opening American position, if you will. And Trump said he hopes to meet with Putin in person in Saudi Arabia to continue their discussions about a possible peace deal. You can criticize Trump, about this if you want to, and certainly a lot of people are doing that. Maybe you think it's in bad taste to have these calls with Putin, but here's the ugly reality of it, Guy, whether anybody wants to admit this or not. Hegseth is probably right. Ukraine can't get all of its territory back. It's not going to take Crimea back militarily, not unless the U.S. is prepared to get much more involved in the conflict with weapons, logistical support, and we're not. Trump's not going to do that. So this is where we are.
It's all moving very quickly, Ben. Can President Trump, with all his rhetorical posturing and controversial statements and unpredictability across so many facets, can he be the world leader that ends wars? A few interesting optics that you didn't mention. One was Hegseth's statement at NATO headquarters in recent days that military forces from European NATO members could conceivably be deployed inside Ukraine at some future date. But if they were, the U.S. position under Trump would be that those troops would not be protected by NATO's Article 5.
And one can imagine what the reaction from European capitals is to that statement, of course.
Well, the meaning there is that if those troops were attacked or somehow in combat in Ukraine, the U.S. would not feel that other NATO nations, such as the U.S., would be required to protect them. That's an interesting nuance and a kind of rhetorical thread the needle aspect of the current Trump administration stance on the prospect of Ukrainian NATO membership in the future. Such membership, remember, Russia has said is a red line that it would not accept. So we're tracking that piece of it at threat status. Another optic, Ben, that I think is interesting to point out was that the big Trump moves on Ukraine war policy in recent days came as Tulsi Gabbard was confirmed to be director of national intelligence. Remember, she was under scrutiny and criticism from Democrats who claimed she's spouted pro-Russian propaganda in the past. All the while, Ben, another optic was that Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was visiting with Trump at the White House in recent days while all these Ukraine developments were unfolding or starting. It's interesting that India, remember, has never sided with Western powers on the Ukraine war. Modi has never openly condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think if you flip the prism here and imagine you were analyzing all of this from the outside, not from Washington, but from, say, India or China or Russia or somewhere in Africa or Latin America, the optic may be that Narendra Modi, leader of the world's most populous democracy, India, injected himself into the middle of things by visiting with Trump just as Trump was ramping up his calls for peace in Ukraine, even if those calls lead to a major geopolitical victory for the Russians. The optic here being that Modi is the great peace mediator. I digress. I'll leave that up to listeners to mull that over. Finally, Ben, I do want to highlight that next week when we do the podcast, I will be in the United Arab Emirates reporting on IDEX 2025. That's essentially the biggest open air arms market in the world, with the most futuristic weapons from sixth generation fighter jets to supersonic cruise missiles and advanced technology drones whose brains are packed with artificial intelligence microchips, all on full display in the heart of the Middle East. IDEX and NAVDEX are taking place from February 17 to 21 in Abu Dhabi. And it won't just be top US, European, and Middle Eastern defense firms showing off their newest stuff. All the major Chinese and Russian firms will all also be there. So we'll have some insider reporting on it in the threat status digital portals at the Washington Times.
One last thing, Guy, before we get into a really great discussion with Richard Crespin about the future of USAID and U.S. soft power and foreign policy abroad. One thing that's kind of jumped out to me over the past few days is sort of the arrival of the Facebook motto, move fast and break things, and how that seems to kind of be the MO at this point of the Trump administration, and specifically Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. Again, we'll unpack the USAID aspect of this in a minute, but the administration under Trump and to some degree Musk is just plowing ahead with everything it wants to do, seemingly regardless of the consequences, legally, politically, even socially. Employees getting fired, money allegedly being withheld, talk of shutting agencies down, executive orders that some people say defy the Constitution, freezing grants, even getting rid of Black History Month and Women's History Month celebrations at the Pentagon, which critics say could be demoralizing for some troops. It's just interesting how fast it's moving. It seems like a lot of stuff could be getting broken in the process, and that's not something we're used to seeing in Washington. It's something you saw in Silicon Valley. Certainly, whether you think it's good or bad depends on your political leanings, but we're deep in uncharted waters in terms of how Washington operates right now.
Well, no doubt, Ben, the pendulum has swung and it is still swinging. I think the question is it still picking up speed or is it beginning to reach its apex? Richard Crespin is CEO of the international consulting firm CollaborateUp and a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's served on multiple boards for companies and NGOs in the U.S. soft power projection and foreign aid space, connected with the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. He's a specialist in bridging the gap between private, public, and civil sectors and bringing public-private partnerships into reality in the international space. He's also an expert on contemporary world affairs. Richard, thank you so much for coming on the Threat Status podcast.
Guy, Ben, it's wonderful to be here. Long-time listener, first-time caller. I love the pod, so thanks for having me on.
The story on everybody's mind right now is, what is Trump doing with USAID? Is he allowing Elon Musk to basically gut and kill it? You wrote an op-ed just before Trump's inauguration that the administration has an opportunity to overhaul USAID. You described USAID as hamstrung by a procurement model that prioritizes paperwork over results. But you also described it as one of the most important tools of American smart power, especially encountering China and Russia on the world stage. Do you see a way forward at this point for USAID as an agency? And why is generally just U.S. foreign aid and smart power projection important, whether USAID is done as an agency or not?
It's a great question, and I think your speculation on the future of the agency is probably as good as mine. As you've noted, I've written quite extensively, both in the Washington Times and for the Center for Strategic International Studies and the Stanford Social Innovation Review, about the importance of reforming U.S. foreign assistance. Over probably 2 decades, I've written about that. It's less important to me what's on the door and more important about what U.S. foreign assistance actually does in the world. And as you point out, I do think that it is a critical tool in American smart power. I am a lifelong Republican. I'm also very much consider myself to be on Team America. And you can't fight something with nothing. The Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, they're out there. They are trying to actively influence emerging countries and in developing markets. They are actively in places where we want to be, where we have critical and important strategic interests. And what I wrote about in many of those articles was that I have often thought that U.S. foreign assistance should be working at the intersection of 3 circles: good development outcomes for the countries that we're partnering with, good U.S. foreign policy outcomes, and good U.S. economic outcomes. I think that kind of prefigured some of the things that Secretary Rubio put in his notice to the State Department, saying that we should be focusing on things that make America stronger, safer, and more prosperous. I think it's a different way of saying what I've been saying for over 2 decades. So that's where I think we need to focus. I think that the agency definitely is in need of reform. There is some fraud, waste, and abuse that I think we've seen in the last few weeks in the news, but it represents like 0.03% of the total budget on a budget that already is less than 1% of the entire federal budget. I did a quick calculation. All U.S. foreign assistance, which is much more than just USAID, represents about 2 months of interest on the national debt. But what is more important to me is that there are certain functions of American soft power and American smart power that we need to retain, whatever logo you put on the door.
You're talking about like clean water programs or counter AIDS education programs in certain African countries, things like that?
Absolutely. There's also, I think you've seen a lot of information about the life-saving work that USAID does, disaster response, humanitarian response, those kinds of things. But there's also just building relationships on the ground. Like if we want to have a lasting relationship with a country, and we want to allow American businesses to do businesses in them, to do conduct trade and commerce in those countries, USAID oftentimes is the front line in terms of building those relationships.
Richard, it's Ben Wolfgang. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm curious if you can kind of walk us and listeners through the right way to think about the projects that the U.S. funds abroad, whether it's through USAID or some other arm of the government. The reason I ask is, as you have certainly seen over the past week or two, we've had critics, some Republican lawmakers pointing out, USAID programs for things like $20,000 for a drag show in Ecuador or $47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia through the State Department. Is it right to kind of call some of those things out and say, why are we funding this? Or is that just sort of missing the forest for the trees, that yes, maybe you can pick out one or two or even a dozen or two things that might be out of line or not the best priorities, but we need to be talking about some of the things that Guy just mentioned, programs in Africa, things like that. Like, what's the right way to think about what we're actually spending the money on right now?
Two things. First of all, in terms of the programs that have been identified, those are absolutely should not have been funded, and those should go away. I do think that they are to some degree being blown out of proportion. I was on a call yesterday with my good friend Andrew Natsios, who was a former USAID administrator, and he pointed out that some of the programs that have been highlighted in the press are from 10 or 20 years ago. So they're really digging back in the archives to try to find programs to pick on. That being said, they shouldn't have happened. So that should absolutely go away. But that is not the majority of what USAID does. I have a pretty simplistic view in that what I think USAID does and should be doing, and what U.S. foreign assistance should be doing, is two things. Number one, keeping bad things over there before they get here. Countering terrorism, violent extremism, early warning on pandemics and epidemics. We have aid workers around the world. That's their job, is to be in touch with those things, identify those things, because tomorrow's epidemic in Congo is an epidemic in the United States if it's not identified early. Today's violent extremism in one country becomes northern migration later, right? So if we have troubles in Guatemala or in Venezuela, if you just take Venezuela as an example, that's a crumbling state that has exported about a quarter of its population because the country fell apart. It fell apart and used to be a prosperous, growing democracy and market capitalist society. It obviously backslid. If we can be in those countries and helping them to build institutions, helping them to strengthen their economies, A, it prevents migration, B, it creates trade opportunities for the United States, and it helps to, as I said, keep bad things over there instead of coming over here.
Richard, is part of this just a messaging void that's out there right now? Because when you put it like that, these, in theory, traditionally would be goals that conservative Republicans would be supportive of, generally speaking.
I mean, not to wax too philosophical, but I think we did kind of lose the plot after the end of the Cold War. Put very bluntly, during the Cold War, we were using foreign assistance to encourage countries to be on our side and not on the side of the Soviets. After the Cold War, I think we sort of started to lose the plot, and we started to drift into pure philanthropy and thinking that this was a purely philanthropic activity and that we didn't have America's self-interest in mind. So to me, in many ways, and I think I wrote this in the piece in the Washington Times that Guy alluded to me, some of this is just a return to normal, a return to the roots of foreign assistance. An America first foreign policy, America first foreign assistance should have America's self-interest in mind.
Richard, let's get technical on what could be established in the wake of what a lot of the mainstream media is characterizing as the Trump-Musk crackdown on USAID. You've advocated for a rebirth of USAID as an agency that adopts a fixed price procurement model, tying payments to clear results rather than expenses. Can you unpack what that means and why you think it could work?
Yeah, this is super technical stuff, but I think it's some of the most important reform that could be done. It's a snow day here in Washington, D.C. If a neighbor kid comes by and says, "Hey, I'll clear your driveway for you," I'll look at it and I'll say, "Okay, well, how much is that going to be?" And he might say $25. I say, "Okay, great. I want you to clear the driveway, but I also want you to do the sidewalk and the front steps." And he says 35, I say 30, we settle on a price, we're done. If friends of his pop out of the bushes and they've got snow blowers and they're done in 5 minutes, I don't go, oh, no, you only took 5 minutes. I'm only going to pay you $5. If on the other hand, he said, oh, I'm going to do it all myself, it's going to take me half a day, and halfway through the project, his shovel breaks and he stops, I'm not going to pay him the full amount. And I'm certainly not going to drive him to the hardware store and buy him a new shovel and have him come back the following day. Well, I might do that because I'm a nice guy, but most people wouldn't, right? So I think we all fundamentally get this idea of a fixed price for a fixed result. So that, fixed price, the $35, fixed result, driveway's done, sidewalk's done, front walk is done. Unfortunately, that's not the way a lot of international development programs work. And that's not just true of international development. It's really all philanthropy. The vast majority of philanthropy works on a cost reimbursement model. So if you apply a cost reimbursement model to my snow analogy, when the neighbor kid comes up, I'd ask him, oh, how much are you going to pay your workers? How much are you paying your parents for the storage of your equipment in their garage? Can you also let me know what it costs for the shovel and all of your different pieces of equipment? And can we agree on an overhead rate for all of that? And if you don't get the work finished, that's okay. I'm just going to keep paying you to reimburse your costs. So if you break the shovel, I'm going to pay to buy you a new shovel. The gold standard in most work is to pay for a result, or pay for an outcome. And that's really what I'm saying here, is that we should be paying for results and trying to tie payments to individual results. And I would also say that in a lot of places, this cost reimbursable model has gotten out of hand, where they're using it for things where there are solid commercial markets for determining what is the price. The cost plus fixed fee model that most of this stuff works on was literally invented to go to the moon, when we had one buyer, one supplier, and you had to have a different way of establishing price. Markets set price, markets should set prices here.
Richard, on that point, do we do any of that now? Does progress, you mentioned that people are reaching back and looking at programs from 15, 20 years ago. Does somebody go back to a program from 10 or 15 years ago and track to see what the progress is today?
That's a great question. And I would say in to a limited degree, yes, but not nearly as much as we should. And one of the challenges in our funding model and our contracting model is that we have short attention spans. Money is appropriated by Congress, right? So by definition, money can't extend beyond the window in which Congress appropriates it. And if the Congress changes its priorities, or if the administration changes its priorities, then oftentimes programs from 10 or 15 years ago just kind of get discarded, and they move on to the next thing. There needs to be a lot more investment in long-term measurement and what we would call adaptive contracting. There's a concept of adaptive management, which is, if I'm not getting the result that I want, I change how I'm doing it. I don't just keep doing the same thing. But the way that contracts are often written, they essentially require you to keep doing the same thing. So we need an adaptive contracting model that would allow you to adjust. Or again, if you pay for a result instead of paying for the process, you can then say, feel free, change it wasn't, whatever you were doing wasn't working before. That's okay. I'm not going to pay you until you're done, but please change your method and keep reporting on what your progress is.
Richard, you brought up the role of private or free market commercial actors. During his first term, Trump pushed market-focused reforms on USAID, basically creating the U.S. International Development Finance Corp, DFC as it's known. And that merged key private capital functions of USAID in a way that actually doubled Washington's fund for ensuring private foreign investments in overseas development projects by American companies. Has that worked? And more broadly, how could U.S. private investment in Africa or anywhere else in the world sort of reshape USAID going forward if we look out to the next 10 or 20 years?
The vice president, when he was campaigning, he made some statements to the effect of that, look, China is out there funding bridges and roads and big infrastructure, and we're lecturing people about their morals. And instead, we should be matching China. And I agree with him. I think we should be focused more on creating the economic and political conditions within countries that support trade, not aid. So in general, I would say trade is better than aid. I would say loans are better than grants as a general rule. But you need what I would call a blended finance model for some of these like really large scale things, because you're not going to be able to get pure commercial investors to step in on say building a bridge or a port or creating access to critical minerals and things like that. You need a blend of some amount of philanthropic or grant capital. You need some technical assistance to help train people in those countries, and then debt and other things. And that's where the DFC comes in. The Development Finance Corporation has both debt and equity authority, so that they can lend money and they can make equity investments. There are some issues with their equity investment model because the way that it was scored by the Office of Management Budget and what's in the congressional authorization for it. It's up for reauthorization this year. We're hoping, and we've seen a lot of progress on the Hill in trying to fix the equity authority part of DFC, but it has been very successful on the debt side. I think that the limitation that it has, and this again comes back to your original question about the future of USAID. And again, I don't really have an opinion about whether it's still called USAID or if it's called something else. You need in-country presence. We manage a small portfolio of debt in the Caribbean, and what we found in doing that, in lending to small businesses in the Caribbean and trying to work with local financial institutions, you can't do that on Zoom. You can't just fly in. You have to have long-term relationships in those countries with those financial institutions. You have to actually be able to walk into the branch or look in that company and see is it doing what it said it was going to do. So you need that in-country presence to make that happen. I think to make the DFC really successful, you need to keep doing that. And we need to be, again, focused on what are the priorities that are going to drive American prosperity in what I hope will be the second American century. We need focus on energy, on digital, on supply chains, and friend shoring and ally shoring. And that's where I think, an all of the above strategy in American foreign assistance that includes whatever critical elements of USAID are retained, as well as the DFC, is really the path forward.
Richard Crespin, CEO of CollaborateUp, thank you for sharing your knowledge, your perspective, and views on the Threat Status Weekly podcast.
Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Guy. Thanks, Ben.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically, or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now this week. Guy, what do you have as your threat of the week?
My threat of the week, Ben, is that the absence of diplomatic engagement between the U.S. and North Korea continues. As former U.S. intelligence official and regular threat status opinion contributor Joe Detrani wrote in recent days, the lack of such engagement during the Biden years resulted in a more belligerent North Korea, now more aligned with Russia and China. My threat of the week is that with so much else going on the geopolitical stage, including the presence of North Korean troops fighting on the Russian side against Ukraine, that the Trump administration won't have the bandwidth to interact directly with North Korea and will miss a key chance to open new diplomatic channels with Pyongyang. And that North Korea may be offended by this and will predictably seize on it to engage in new provocations, like perhaps a new nuclear weapon test that destabilizes Northeast Asia.
Yeah, North Korea not made a lot of headlines in the first few weeks of the Trump administration. Guy, my threat of the week is name changes and the confusion and problems they can sometimes cause for us as a society. And there are two good examples of this over the past couple of days. Defense Secretary Hegseth announced earlier this week he's changing the name of North Carolina's Fort Liberty back to its original name, Fort Bragg, except this time it's going to be named after World War II veteran Roland Bragg instead of Confederate General Braxton Bragg. The name was changed the first time back in the summer of 2023, and I was in Fayetteville, North Carolina for the name change ceremony to Fort Liberty, and it was a huge deal For example, the Ford dealership in Fayetteville changed its name to Liberty Ford. Is it going to change it back now? There's a lot of work that went on behind the scenes around that name change. So this is a big deal. And it's also a big deal that President Trump wanted to change the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. Google announced that it would indeed change the name in its Maps app for U.S. users. So here in America, you'll see Gulf of America. In Mexico, you'd see Gulf of Mexico. The Associated Press said it would keep calling it the Gulf of Mexico because its stories are read by people all over the world. And that caused a major dispute with the White House, which reportedly led to an AP reporter.
Ben, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just checked my iPhone and on Maps, it is now called the Gulf of America.
I checked it as well before we came on. Absolutely. The Gulf of America. So this led to this dispute with the AP reporter who was reportedly banned from the Oval Office because the AP refuses to call it the Gulf of America. So the bottom line here, guy, is this is a threat right now to me, because whether you're talking about local economies in Fayetteville, North Carolina, or journalists, agreements about what things should be called, name changes can stir up a lot of passion and controversy and present a host of problems across U.S. society. And with that, thank you all so much. Thank you, Guy, of course. Huge thanks to Richard Crespin for that great discussion. And thank you all for listening. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Guy and I will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.